A great business. Right. Good. Oh, I believe it. Yeah. Fairly right on.
I think I have to introduce you.
Oh, you are?
I believe that's the.
Okay. Do you need a bio or something?
I can read a bio, but if you'll permit me, I'll just
Make it up as you go.
make a few remarks and then you're fairly well known to the universe. So.
Well, not to this crowd. I'm not a Beethoven interpretation expert.
This is true. This is more of a performance crowd. But, it's good to show up.
Well, this is going to be a kind of nuts and bolts. Getting into organology a little bit. It's pretty kind of out of place almost. This crowd.
They'll survive it.
Yeah.
Are you really retired?
Yes. I'm retired from the broadcast
All right, if I can start to bring us together.
Well done.
Thank you.
I've got just the one for you.
Do you? What is it?
It does a Rogero.
Where is it? Where's it now? I can't wait till I tell my husband.
Yeah, they'll say,
Oh, good. So many places I'd like to put it. Under the soundboard, blue strips from a Rogero lecture poster. It's original.
It's awesome.
I did a lecture at wrong side. So,
Yeah. What, marketer? So yes, he lived in Dublin, which is how he came from Germany to England to military course, and then to England.
okay, right, that's right.
And he went back, he had a London studio for a while, and he went to Germany. Always after that, follow the money.
Right. You came after all?
Yeah, I had a
Your other thing
cancellation. I
come
had a
through.
cancellation.
All right. Welcome to the second keynote address, and we are delighted to have John Watson with us today. As a personal note, I began my descent into the madness of early keyboards, and John was one of my very first acquaintances who became a good friend in this effort. He has advised me as a collector and then as a proto museum professional on best practices, things to watch out for, little bumps that hit you in the night and that sort of thing. It's just been tremendously helpful. So I would be remiss in not mentioning that John and Ann Acker are both on my board of advisors for Civil Music Museum, and we really appreciate the work that both of you do to keep me on track. It's not easy, but they're doing an excellent job, and they're finding neat things for the museum to consider as we go forward. John got his start in music and has a degree in music. I think it was encountering Zuckerman's book on the American harpsichord that kind of got the first spark in your head that, gosh, you could go make these things. And so he made a harpsichord from scratch, and one harpsichord can lead to another, and then to another, and I've lost count how many you made in your life. But John began to work with the folks at Colonial Williamsburg, ultimately became a member of the staff, and finally, the curator of musical instruments at Colonial Williamsburg, where he would, make copies of instruments, copies of actions, so that instruments would not be overly damaged in the use of them. And it sort of changed its sensitivities, as it has changed all of our sensitivities, as to when we say, oh, okay, it's broken, we must go fix it. Yes, but before you go fix it and take the toolbox out, think of what they're going to be asking in 100 or 200 years from now. Because in this conference, we've covered anything from a few years ago to 500 years ago. And it's telling what we would have loved to have known that we didn't. So John has gotten us all to be thinking about that in a real and meaningful way. Gosh, you've influenced hundreds of people around the world, and certainly in this country, just in this manner of how do we approach the instrument. It's an object of study as well as it has a final purpose. Almost 2 years ago, we got inspired. If you follow clavichords and harpsichords, there's a well-known book by Donald Bolch that came out in 3 editions. The last and third edition was 1995. It was not published in any real quantity, and so if you want to buy one, you must dig deep into your wallet. And it's all out of date, as all catalogs are. So my friend in the UK, David Hackett, had lamented once again that we didn't have an online version like we do with Klingscale, which John and Martha Klingscale really developed this sense of a updatable online catalog. So when we thought about Bolch, it's like, now if we do something like that, what does it mean? Well, what it really means is that you need sustainability throughout, not just in John's lifetime or my lifetime, but everybody. So we've set up a nonprofit called the Musical Instrument Research Catalog, MeerKAT, and that nonprofit is now going to be the umbrella organization to take care of things like Clean Scale, Bolshoi Online, the Langwell Index, and other archival things that we, as musicologists, need to be thinking about what happens to it when I'm dead. All of us have these wonderful files and such, and what happens to it when we're gone. So, John, thank you for all the work that you've done. He's my vice president, I'm the president. Doesn't mean anything. It's simply that we wanted to see this thing happen. We put together a team of like-minded individuals. If you're interested in hearing more about this, please ask us afterwards. But I think it's going to be the next 10 years of John's life as he looks into doing this. So, John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, we've gotten to be kind of partners in crime, I guess. And thanks for the little advertisement about MeerKAT. We're the Meerkats. Watch this page. And thank you to the program committee for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about some of the perspective that I've had the opportunity to have. And really, this is just going to be some vignettes, some stories out of my contact with the keyboard history of North America. I'm particularly pleased that the venue for this conference theme, Between Old Worlds and New, is here at the Sigel Music Museum. More than many museums, this one celebrates the cultural heritage of its own nation and region and lifts up the instruments and musical culture of all levels of musical life, including the domestic. What better place to contemplate the inheritance of European music and its integration and transformation in the New World? My goal for the next few minutes is to share selected scenes that were encounters between the established centers of European culture and its settlements along the eastern shore of North America. The earliest reference to a stringed keyboard instrument that I'm aware of is an item in the 1685 estate inventory of Thomas Jordan in Surry County, Virginia, marked here on an up-to-date, for the time, map. It listed, quote, a pair of very old virginals, and that virginals may not have been the first to find its way over here. By 1645, the British governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley, brought his fully developed court life and taste to the colonial American frontier. And we're not talking about a one-room log cabin in the woods. He built a typical English manor house with spaces for public entertainments surrounded by a park-like landscape. A wealthy and sophisticated English peer was not about to leave behind his accustomed comforts and entertainments, and considered it part of his role to bring that culture to his isolated colonial constituents. The house Governor Berkeley built was the most lavish and elaborated entertainment space in any known public or private structure in 17th century British North America. The building has left only archaeological evidence, and any record of music making there is also gone, but a pair of virginals would have been in keeping with the environment. I have numerous colleagues that are archaeologists in the Williamsburg area and a lot of historic sites, and I'm always describing what tuning pins would look like after 200 years underground. References to spinets and harpsichords naturally pick up in the early years of the 18th century, but the next vignette we'll consider is a remarkably early appearance of a piano in colonial America that has gone mostly unnoticed until recently. This instrument has been at the Moravian Historical Society in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, as far back as anyone knows. It has only 4 octaves, of which less than half have ever had dampers. And what dampers it does have can be disabled. And curiously, the hammers can be shifted to strike either with a hard metal tip, presumably to create a brittle harpsichord-like sound, or with a leather-covered tip to produce what might be interpreted as a slightly more piano-like sound. The instrument seems not to fit any standard type, not a square piano or grand piano, and not even quite like other upright pianos we've seen. It raises some interesting questions. Number one, who made the instrument? John Coster already proved through scientific wood identification that it was most surprisingly made on this side of the Atlantic. Number two, when was it made? Can there be an explanation for how a piano could be made in Pennsylvania decades earlier than expected? In fact, there's a cherished belief among the Moravians in Nazareth that the instrument might have appeared as early as 1746, but on the surface, that seemed highly improbable. Number three, why was the piano designed with hammers that could be shifted, so a hard metal tip or a soft leather-covered tip would strike the strings? Number four, why are there so few dampers, and why even provide a hand stop to disengage them entirely? Two more mysteries turned up during a closer examination of the instrument. Number five, how did the maker acquire the high level of knowledge and skill evident in the instrument? This was clearly not the workmanship or mechanical design we would expect of a dabbler on the colonial frontier. And number six, why did the maker employ even earlier principles in planning string lengths? Experimental archaeology is a process of learning about the past through the making of reproductions as much like the originals as possible, and using period methods as much as possible. Clues about the past not found in documentary sources can be revealed this way. You'll recognize this as the workshop equivalent to the enlightenment that a modern pianist gets when sitting down to a forte piano. And so colleagues Tom and Michelle Winter and I met at the Moravian Historical Society in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, for an in-depth examination. We had two objectives. The first was to plan our making of a playable reproduction of the instrument. The second was to seek answers to those questions about who might have made it and what guided their design choices. Our conclusions about the original maker are the subject of my article and a companion article by John Coster, both in the most recent Journal of the American Musical Instruments Society. For reasons laid out in those articles, we concluded that the instrument was most likely made by John Clem. It's a bold claim, considering that Clem died already in 1762, more than a decade before the first previously known appearance of a piano in North America. That being the John Berendt grand piano, advertised in Philadelphia in 1775. The very instrument in that 1775 advertisement is believed to be the one recently rediscovered and now here at the Sigel Music Museum. And regardless of the Moravian upright piano, the Berendt piano remains the earliest known grand piano made in America, in British North America. The extensive article by Tom Strange and Alexandra Cade about the Berendt piano is also, by the way, in the 2022 AMIS journal. That trio of articles now making that volume an essential reference for the beginnings of American piano history. I'll leave it to those articles to spin out the sleuthing that finally brought us to a John Clem attribution, including analysis of its archaic string scaling and clues in the materials and workmanship of the instrument. But for today's purposes, we should focus on how this instrument represents a remarkable example of European keyboard culture landing in the New World. Born in 1690 in Dresden, Johann Gottlob Klemm spent the first half of his adult life as a practicing maker of organs, harpsichords, and clavichords in Dresden, until he immigrated to the American colonies in 1733, soon settling in Philadelphia and anglicizing his name to John Klemm. His formative period in Dresden in the 1720s is the time and place where Pantaleon Hebenstreit was at the peak of his fame. Hebenstreit was spectacularly popular as a virtuoso who toured Europe, performing on a type of oversized hammered dulcimer, named after him, the Pantalon. This image is not him, but one of his students, and the original Pantalon was actually much larger than the one shown. It may have stood upright. Through his ability to elicit a variety of sounds from his Pantalon by using hard or soft mallets and different sets of metal or gut strings, Hebenstreit has been widely credited with influencing the first generation of Saxon piano makers. And just think about it. In 1720s Dresden, surely every enterprising organ and harpsichord maker must have thought about inventing some way to operate those dulcimer mallets with a keyboard. It would make the difficult-to-play Pantalon accessible to anyone who can play a keyboard, not to mention serve as a profitable new product for their workshop. These early experiments in Saxony were not attempts to make pianos per se. Practically speaking, pianos hardly existed in the 1720s, Dresden, and to be honest, anywhere else. But when you think about it, adding a keyboard to a dulcimer fits the definition of a piano. And in fact, years later, and only after the piano finally became widely accepted, several Saxon keyboard makers claimed to have invented the piano independent of Cristofori. John Coster proposed in the 1990s that there was not one but two nearly contemporaneous inventions of the piano, one in Italy and the other in Germany. Michael Latcham independently arrived at the same idea in his recent book, Towards a New History of the Piano. But Latcham's book greatly expanded upon the concept, demonstrating how the first century of piano history was an intertwining of two separate lineages. The Hebenstreit-inspired Dresden lineage was characterized by the ability to create different kinds of sounds, like the hard and soft mallets of Hebenstreit's Pantalon. Also, dampers were rarely provided, but if they were, some method was usually provided to turn them off. In contrast to the Hebenstreit-inspired pianos, Cristofori was not interested in providing a variety of voices. For Cristofori, the piano's expressive capacity came from its being touch-sensitive, giving players the ability to shape phrases through continual nuances of volume and, with dampers on every note, the ability to articulate. All of this is not to dispute that Cristofori invented the piano sometime around 1700 in Italy, but to acknowledge a separate German tributary to that stream, a separate lineage that remained influential in piano design into the second decade of the 19th century. The German lineage was responsible for a fascination that persisted throughout the 18th century, a fascination with stops that could change the sounds like an organ or harpsichord or dulcimer. Stops for so-called Turkish music are probably most familiar to us, but the familiar instrumentarium of hip piano performances gives little sense of the great diversity of piano stops that appeared throughout the 18th century. The The Latcham book is an eye-opening account of that diversity as the Dresden and Italian lineages intertwined until the Cristofori lineage finally won out. Yet perhaps the survival of a pedal to eliminate all damping, not envisioned by Cristofori, could be considered a remnant of the Dresden strand, still alive in the modern piano. So after his formative period in Dresden in the 1720s, John Clem, now settled in eastern Pennsylvania, finally got around to making a Hebenstreit-inspired keyboard instrument, what we would call a piano, in the only way he imagined such an instrument. Having lived in the colonies since 1733, he probably had never seen a piano, with the possible exception of those early experiments back in Saxony. We do know of at least one Hammerklavier that was advertised in Leipzig 2 years before Clem left for the American colonies, but we don't know if he had seen that instrument or any other. When he finally got around to to making his Hebenstreit-inspired dulcimer with keyboard, piano, Clem naturally gave the player the ability to change whether the hammers strike the strings with a soft leather tip or with a hard brass tip. He wasn't sure whether to bother adding dampers. Hebenstreit's Pantalon didn't have any. So he ended up only installing dampers on less than half the notes and provided a hand stop to eliminate them entirely. What did I say, Tom? And when it came to laying out the string lengths, the old artisan used design principles he had learned in his youth, principles that were already becoming old-fashioned in 1720. If attribution to Clem is correct, oh, thank you. Thank you. If attribution to Clem is correct, a construction date before 1762, the year of Clem's death, makes this instrument, in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, the oldest known surviving piano of any form made in North America or England. Who would have looked to rural Pennsylvania for one of the best representatives of the Saxon origins of the piano? Another excellent example is, much less surprisingly, this one in Leipzig, and perhaps not coincidentally, in a very similar form. Our odd little vertical piano in Pennsylvania turns out to be no less than an emissary from the beginnings of piano history that has been here since the first half of the 18th century. The Hebenstreit lineage didn't always just blend into the Cristofori lineage, but occasionally turned up in an almost pure form from time to time throughout the 18th century. The instrument Stephanie played for us this morning is a prime example, right here in the Sigel Music Museum. Hard hammers, no dampers, and 2 hand stops to change the sound. So we did make a playable reproduction of the little upright piano. We avoided restoring the original. It certainly would have been restorable, but it was too important to restore. The evidence was too important, so we made a reproduction to play that. Most of the action for the instrument was made by Tom Winter in San Francisco, and I made the rest in Williamsburg. That worked out well because it was the COVID-19 year, and so we needed to separate. I've made a brief informal video to give an idea of the instrument's sound. It features 2 movements from Johann Kuhnau's Biblical Sonata No. 4, published in 1700. Kuhnau was one of the few Saxon contemporaries of Hebenstreit who was also skilled at playing the Pantalon, that is, the large dulcimer without a keyboard. After one movement of our little video, that'll demonstrate the sounds, and it'll label. Should be obvious to your ear when the sound is changed, but it'll also be labeled when the stop is changed. After one movement demonstrating the sounds, another movement continues with a few slides showing the examination and the reproduction process. As you can see, the reproduction is at the museum shown alongside the original instruments. They're both there. This 1755 map gives a sense of the world we're talking about and how different it was from our own. Perhaps it was because of the promise of opportunity in England and America that so many instrument makers of German heritage immigrated to the English-speaking world. Whatever the reason, they had an outsized impact on the development of stringed keyboard instruments in the 18th and far into the 19th centuries. My unscientific impression is that as many as half of the makers in London and in British North America at the turn of the 19th century were of German heritage. When you think about it, when you think about immigration patterns, with the heaviest concentration of Germans in Pennsylvania, it's not surprising to realize that Pennsylvania, and not necessarily Philadelphia, but rural Pennsylvania as well, became the cradle of the American keyboard industry. And for this observation, I credit Lawrence Libben, the retired curator of instruments at the Metropolitan Museum. John Clem, working in Pennsylvania, was one of the first German-American immigrants contributing significantly to keyboard culture on this side of the Atlantic. His protege, David Tannenberg, also from Saxony, became early America's best-known organ builder. But in 18th century North America, and for the obvious geopolitical reasons, the influence of England was far and away the dominant in colonial America. The Pennsylvania German activity we've been talking about was seminal for American keyboard heritage, but in terms of its output of instruments, it was small. The production of harpsichords and pianos on a large scale, enough to satisfy the growing population, would take a degree of manufacturing infrastructure that would not develop here until the second decade of the 19th century. In the 18th century, the source for nearly all stringed keyboard instruments was England, and to be clear, almost entirely London. In the spirit of critical theory, we should consider for a moment a gender issue that's part of our colonial DNA. Whatever some people might still be saying to dismiss England for its lack of homegrown celebrity composers, there was, for better or worse, a reason why England's principal contribution would be in the large-scale making of instruments. It was an overtly stated belief in England and the U.S. at the time that the highest aspiration a young man of the gentry class could have is to excel in business and manufacturing. In that cultural context, music had a certain limitation placed on it. Music was a fine pastime, but should not be a distraction from a young man's developing knowledge of business and technology. As for young women, that was a different story. Proficiency on the harpsichord, piano, or English guitar was among the so-called accomplishments that equipped her for a favorable marriage. Consequently, it was in the production of keyboard instruments that England made its greatest contribution to keyboard history. It explains why one gets, again, the unscientific impression that there were more British instruments on the continent than continental instruments in England, while most of the best-known composers and virtuosi in England, including Handel, J.C. Bach, and Clementi, were actually transplants from the continent. And that pattern of fathers purchasing keyboard instruments for daughters was nevertheless so often repeated in late 18th and early 19th century and in American England that Michael Cole has called it the major driver of the piano economy in that period, supporting a very large number of instrument makers and dealers. It feels a little passé to be looking at overprivileged white males like these for our understanding of history, so I'm almost apologetic about giving them any special attention. They may have been the most known for writing and signing the Declarations of Independence or the Constitutions and otherwise creating foundations of the United States form of government. But you might be astonished to know how much they were also engaged with keyboard musical instruments. As thinking participants in the Age of Enlightenment, keyboard instruments were to them as much scientific instruments as musical instruments, and worthy of special attention. Also, because their extreme historical importance, that is, the extreme importance of these individuals, was understood by everyone, even during their lifetimes, copies of their prodigious papers and correspondence were saved, including those about musical instruments, many of their exchanges with their equals across the ocean. Since we have occasion to consider Benjamin Franklin, and since tonight we will be changing our clocks for daylight savings time announcement if you have a plane to catch tomorrow, here's a fun fact from this morning's New York Times. Quote, Franklin is often credited as the first to suggest it, the time change, after he realized he was wasting his Parisian mornings by staying in bed. He proposed that the French fire cannons at sunrise to wake people up and to reduce candle consumption at night. But I digress. Benjamin Franklin's invention of the glass harmonica in 1761 made a splash in Europe. That wasn't a pun. In Europe, even more than this side of the Atlantic. While that is not a keyboard instrument, another founder and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Francis Hopkinson, did something about Franklin's oversight. Hopkinson, who was also a composer, player, and innovator, invented a way to add a keyboard to Franklin's glass harmonica. Sound familiar? Hopkinson had this portrait painted in 1785, the same year he was in correspondence with Thomas Jefferson about his better-known experiments with harpsichord plectra, a subject Hopkinson presented 4 times to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. George Washington purchased a harpsichord in 1793 that was of an innovative design that one could actually argue, or was intended to be, as expressive as a pianoforte, about which more later. And James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, purchased a Philadelphia square piano for his Montpelier estate in 1794. I had the privilege of finding this piano of exactly that year made in Philadelphia for Montpelier, so they have it there now. And Thomas Jefferson, though not a keyboard player himself, was involved in the rental or purchase or near purchase of more than a dozen keyboard instruments over his life, including multiple clavichords, harpsichords, pianos, and organs. As if he needed a claim to fame, Jefferson made it into the Oxford English Dictionary for his early use of the term forte piano. It was 1771, and he was writing to his purchasing agent to change his original order for a Hamburg clavichord because, quote, I have since seen a forte piano and am charmed by it. Send me this instrument instead of the clavichord. I'd like to thank Nick Nolte and Gwyneth Paltrow for posing as Jefferson and his daughter Martha, shown here in the film Jefferson in Paris. Jefferson's first major harpsichord purchase was made during his time as ambassador to France in 1785. His 14-year-old daughter Martha, whom he called Patsy, was with him in Paris and taking harpsichord lessons from no less than Claude Balbastre. It was time to order a harpsichord for use at Monticello. And his 1786 correspondence about the purchase was transcribed in Raymond Russell's seminal 1959 book on the harpsichord and clavichord. Here was Thomas Jefferson in Paris buying a large quantity of French furniture to send back to Virginia. But when it came to selecting a harpsichord, Jefferson chose Kirkman. I've often thought about how close we came to seeing a brand new Tascam harpsichord arriving in the mountains of Virginia in 1786. But it was on the well-informed advice of his friend Charles Burney, who had seen all kinds of harpsichords on his travels and advised that Kirkman made the best. Once again, Jefferson was very hands-on to specify the musical and mechanical features that he wanted. 2 manuals, machine and Venetian swell stops, and curiously, a Celestini stop. Jefferson requested that last feature over the objections of Kirkman, who didn't like the Celestini. The contraption would have to be added after completion in the Kirkman shop by the London mechanic who invented it, a Mr. Walker. The Celestini was a mechanism for sustaining the sound of a harpsichord. It consisted of a continuous rosined ribbon or twine that passed over the strings. When a key was depressed, a tab attached to the jack would bring the ribbon in contact with the string, thus causing the note to sound as long as the key was depressed, like a continuous bow on a violin string. A few years later, Jefferson ordered another instrument, this time for his other daughter, Maria. It was already 1798, and Jefferson was disappointed that young Maria specified that it should be a harpsichord and not a more up-to-date pianoforte. Incidentally, Maria's harpsichord came back to Monticello in 1820 after her early death, and the instrument required restoration. Now, let that sink in. It was 1820 when harpsichords were generally in a deep sleep. Here is a harpsichord restoration, and with help from his enslaved cabinet maker, undertaken by the man credited with writing the American Declaration of Independence. Unfortunately, the two instruments shown here are stand-ins. Neither of the Jefferson harpsichords ultimately survived. And the one currently exhibited at Monticello is a simple single manual, Kirkman, in the too early date of 1762. As mentioned, Jefferson owned, lots more than 2 keyboard instruments in his life. And there were only 2 daughters, so clearly not all of his purchases were for daughters. 2 years after ordering the harpsichord for Maria, the very year this portrait was painted, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were both running for president and were tied, each receiving 73 electoral votes. Yet with all that going on, Jefferson was writing to one of his regular correspondents, a Philadelphia engineer, poet, and preacher named John Isaac Hawkins, who had patented what he called a portable grand piano. Hawkins' invention is considered by most histories of the piano as the first upright piano made on either side of the Atlantic to be in an upright form. And it was innovative in several other ways, not the least because it used metal for its internal structure. It was characteristic of Jefferson that he couldn't resist the newest technology. And that turns up over and over again. If you know much about Thomas Jefferson, everything he had, he loved technology. Remember, in 1800, the federal government was operating out of Philadelphia. So as John Adams' vice president, Jefferson was there when he wrote to his daughter Martha, quote, "A person here has invented the prettiest improvement to the forte piano I have ever seen. It has tempted me to engage one for Monticello, partly for its excellence and convenience, partly to assist a very ingenious, modest, and poor young man who ought to make a fortune by his invention." As happens with some cutting-edge technology, the bugs were not yet worked out, and the instrument couldn't hold tune. But it was a brilliant invention, and amazingly, you can see 2 very rare examples here in the Sigel collection, both by Hawkins. Don't be confused by the fact that the instrument in the photo was made in London, not Philadelphia. Hawkins had moved to London to patent his invention there also, and both Hawkins pianos in the collection here are from his London period. That pattern of fathers purchasing keyboard instruments for their teenage daughters turned up again at George Washington's Mount Vernon. George and Martha were childless, but there was a step-granddaughter that they raised as their own. There are many really fascinating things about the Mount Vernon story, starting with the fact that before Washington provided young Nellie Custis with a double manual harpsichord, she first was provided with a piano. It was 1789. George Washington was in his first term as president. The federal government was starting out based in New York City, and Nellie was taking lessons there from the celebrated musician-composer Alexander Reinagel. The square piano was made for them by Thomas Dodds, one of New York's first generation of piano makers. Every indication is that the piano was a humble instrument, and for various reasons, Washington finally ordered a large, fully equipped two-manual harpsichord for young Nellie. The instrument survives. Let's see, am I one ahead? The instrument survives to the present day, and the internal mechanism has spectacularly escaped any restoration, even retaining old dampers and original all-leather plectrum. That last detail has provided the most revealing glimpse into late 18th century thinking about the continuing role of harpsichords so late in their period of popularity. That's because the leather plectra was not the hard stuff we now associate with German production harpsichords in the early 20th century, but more akin to the pot de buffle, popularized shortly before by Tesquin in Paris. If anyone is surprised at the choice of a harpsichord years after acquiring a piano, it might say more about our own bias, thinking pianos are simply more evolved and up-to-date in 1793. But make no mistake, for people like the Washingtons, the newest harpsichords remained fully viable as expressive musical instruments. Remember, too, that the comparison from their perspective was between the 1789 New York Thomas Dodd square piano, representing the raw beginnings of a provincial industry, and a harpsichord from London at the culmination of 3 centuries of evolution. Not a fair fight. Of course, the comparison is unfair since the new keyboard selected for Mount Vernon could have been a state-of-the-art grand piano from Broadwood, like this one here at the Sigel Music Museum, or even one from Longman and Broderick, who supplied the harpsichord. There are several possible explanations. Consider that the musical specifications of the harpsichord they ordered suggest the choice might not have been so retro after all. Conventional harpsichords lack the ability for nuanced control of dynamics the way pianos do. But this was not a conventional harpsichord. Harpsichords in England had evolved numerous appendages for controlling volume, and none more so than Mount Vernon's new harpsichord. Not only was the instrument equipped with a pedal-operated machine stop and Venetian swell, but also those soft leather plectra on all 4 registers. In short, this harpsichord, with all of its volume-controlling features, was probably considered the expressive equal of the best grand pianos of the period. I would add, however true that might be, it was a lot more work. I mean, speaking as I made a reproduction of this instrument for Mount Vernon. It's a lot easier to make a piano that gets the dynamic nuance naturally than to make a harpsichord and add all those contraptions to get it to do the same thing, serve the same repertoire. It was my privilege to make a very close copy of the Mount Vernon harpsichord a few years ago, and the reproduction now takes the place of the original in the mansion at Mount Vernon. So the original harpsichord could be under better controlled conditions of a modern museum space. You can see much more about the reproduction project on the Mount Vernon website, where there are also several demonstrations played by Joyce Lindorf. Joyce did 2 research fellowships at the library at Mount Vernon to focus on the Nellie Custis's music, and she was serving one of those fellowships when I delivered the reproduction, so she was able to tear into it right away. Our last vignette starts in 1799 in my adopted hometown of Williamsburg. It's yet another example of an impressive keyboard instrument purchased by the patriarch of an influential Virginia family for a teenage daughter. From the standpoint of scale and complexity, this instrument is a superlative example, very likely the largest and most complex domestic keyboard instrument in the United States at the time. An upright grand piano combined with a 6-stop organ. The story of this instrument actually starts in London in the 1790s. The firm of Longman and Broderick had just gone out of business. And there's a reason to believe that just the upright piano portion of our combination instrument was part of the unsold stock at L&B. Muzio Clementi was, as you know, one of those musicians from the continent who made his career in London. The thought would seem ludicrous to us that Clementi would have been hurting for respectability, but in English society, as a musician, he was to some extent a much glorified migrant worker. At least, not the kind of landowning man of commerce and technology that would make him a quote-unquote gentleman. But Clementi would demonstrate by his own grit and determination what had to be done to make that transition, to become a proper English gentleman. In late 1798, he ventured into the world of manufacturing and music merchandising when he went into business with a group of partners to fill the void left by Longman and Broderick. The firm would be called Longman Clementi and Company. Hardly a year later, Longman left the firm and it remained Clementi and Company until Clementi's death in 1732. A popular trend reaching its peak about that time was to add a couple ranks of pipes to a piano, giving the musician command over what amounts to a whole ensemble that could play melody, harmony, and accompaniment with several distinct voices, all played independently or together by a single musician. This is a typical example of what was purchased. This is a typical example. It was purchased by Tom Strange and kindly donated to Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. The piano was made by William Rolfe in London and shipped to Germantown near Philadelphia, where it was then, immediately still as a new instrument, organized by Pennsylvania German maker John Sellers. These organized pianos, as they were called in the period, were appearing with regularity in England, France, and the US, usually in this form: a standard square piano with a couple ranks of organ pipes and bellows filling the space below. Organized pianos turn up frequently in advertisements, such as these from Alexandria and Baltimore newspapers. So Clementi's new firm already had in its stock the recently made upright grand piano. One of the other partners in Longman Clementi and Company was the organ builder James Davis, and it might have been his idea to organize the upright grand piano, his signature appearing on the interior. It's just possible that organizing an upright grand piano was an experiment not to be repeated, as we know of no other example of this form in existence anywhere. And I must say, having done the restoration of this instrument, there are some particular challenges to do a little work on the action. You have to lift the piano off the organ so you could get to the action from the back. So it takes a lot of work to do just some fairly simple routine maintenance. So it might have been a form that was didn't catch on, in part because it was difficult to service. Meanwhile, back in Williamsburg, Virginia, St. George Tucker was a prominent lawyer, judge, and professor at the College of William and Mary. He was also patriarch of an extended family of notable lawyers, professors, and politicians, and as such, keeping up appearances was vital. His two daughters, Fanny and Polly, were reaching marrying age. And as we've seen, attracting a husband of the best social class was partly the father's task in that society. Just as Thomas Jefferson bought major instruments for both of his daughters, so it was in the Tucker household. The organized upright grand piano from Longman, Clementi and Company arrived in Williamsburg in May 1799. The local cabinet maker in Williamsburg was Benjamin Bucktrout, who had considerable experience with keyboard instruments, actually advertising when he arrived from England 30 years earlier, quote, "Spinets and harpsichords made and repaired." So Bucktrout was the obvious person to set up the organized piano. His receipt for doing so survives. Notice that it was called an organized harpsichord. That was because in those days a normal piano was the square type, and grand pianos were still often called a piano in the shape of a harpsichord, or simply harpsichord. As we can see in this 1794 Philadelphia newspaper ad announcing the arrival of Trout and Wiedberg. The organized piano apparently proved to be more than the young Fanny Tucker could fit into her fledgling married lifestyle, and the instrument was soon moved first to one Virginia plantation site, and then to another, where it stood for the next century. On its first move from Williamsburg to Shirley Plantation, there is evidence that it was caught in an unexpected rainstorm, causing water damage to both the piano and the organ. We know this because there are iron stains in clearly very early repairs. Inside the bellows is the flamboyant inscription by Christian Veltenaire. He and his brother John Veltenaire were French itinerant music masters, Christian taking on instrument tuning and repairs, and his brother John being the music teacher. They worked in numerous cities in the Middle Atlantic region. The organized piano somehow survived to the present day, finally finding its way back to Williamsburg, and was the focus of my final 3.5 years at Colonial Williamsburg, where I oversaw its restoration to playing condition. That project will be partly detailed in the next issue of our journal, Keyboard Perspectives. Meanwhile, you can see and hear the instrument in a new musical instrument exhibit, Making Music in Early America, at the museums of Colonial Williamsburg. The main takeaway for our conference theme from this instrument is not that large organized grand pianos played a significant role in U.S. keyboard history. On the contrary, there's some evidence that the instrument soon lost its piano functions for lack of anyone able to maintain it. Rather, the instrument represents something about the musical aspirations of colonial Americans, and even more so, it shares with the ancient Pennsylvania German piano how embers of European musical culture landed in America, sometimes igniting a new musical phenomenon in the New World, and other times simply preserved here, perhaps as curiosities, but now serving as ports of entry for us into the musical world of the old world. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, so
keyboard, whatever you want to call it. It's in Pennsylvania.
Didn't it? Yeah.
Why it was built as a vertical?
Well, we don't know, but again, as I mentioned, the Hebenstreit pentalon might have stood upright. In fact, it had a set of metal strings and a set of gut strings, and it probably would have been easier to twirl the thing around to get different sounds. We don't know, but also think of this, you know, he didn't have models to copy. He didn't have any piano. He was basically inventing this from a vague, you know, experience of this dulcimer type instrument, and how can I build a keyboard to go with it? So he was basically, you know, I mean, all pianos looked like that in Pennsylvania at that time. It's,
So this idea of a hammer that has two different materials that
Yeah.
you can engage by
Yeah.
sliding, the only place I've seen that before is the Tangenten of Spade and Small.
right.
And I'm wondering whether, I mean, that's much later.
However, another source could have been the clavichords that could shift a little bit. How early, where's Daryl? How early would you find that, a clavichord with this tangents that have, yeah, I don't know how early they, when?
1770s, 1780s.
Oh, that late, okay, so maybe that wasn't the.
So that means that's a contemporary with
Yeah.
those Tangenten.
But as a mechanic, you're presented with, how can I'm trying to make a hammered dulcimer with a keyboard, and you've got to have different sounds. And the most radical change of sound that Hebenstreit or any other hammered dulcimer player can do is pick up a different set of you know, hard or soft mallets.
Right. So my question for you really is, so between this example that you think is from 17...
I think probably pre-1750.
Right, and the Spade and Small things which are from the 1770s.
Ah. Yeah.
Do you know of any other instruments that did this?
Yeah, right. I had a very interesting series of emails with Michael Cole. Michael has a belief that, you know, he's a piano historian, he's written some books, articles. His belief was that there's a type of piano called a pantalon, and in fact, he says it's either a piano or it's a pantalon, and he distinguishes between the two. I had quite a debate with him because as the intertwining concept shows, that the elements of a keyboard pantalon and a pianoforte were mixed, and so we're constantly raising this argument. Well, is this instrument more this or more that? Which is it? Is this a piano or is it a pantalon? And Michael Cole's solution to that is, don't waste your time. If it has hammers and it strikes strings, it's a piano. The question is it going to be more Hebenstreit inspired or pantalon inspired, if you want, or not?
Just a little post with that. I think it's interesting just to see the number of different names that people in the period were using
Yeah,
for all these
yeah,
instruments.
many.
Yeah, and of course there are instruments that look like square pianos that are called pantalons and
Right.
sold by their name because there's pantalons, which
Right,
probably are just
that's
not
true.
mapping. And the clavecin royal with all its
Right.
stops. And
Yep.
so I think there you gauge a sense for just the ways in which people in the period are thinking about the differences amongst all these instruments and the types of sound effects they're trying to get out of them.
Right.
So maybe that was a little clue into how people were hearing, even if the thing is fundamentally the same object. But that's one point. And then I was just going to point, of course, to the wonderful automaton of Marie Antoinette playing the harpsichord, and in fact it's a hammered dulcimer
Oh, yeah.
that she's playing with a key. It looks like she's playing a keyed hammered dulcimer.
But it's,
But
But it's
looks like-
mallets.
Yes, a
Yeah.
harpsichord, but it's actually a dulcimer.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the hammers are in fact not operated by the keyboard, but by a mechanism.
I actually thought a little bit about that when the question this morning and Stephanie making the comment about maybe this harp was a way of adding a keyboard to a harp. I think when you add a keyboard to a harp, it's called a harpsichord, because because harps are plucked. But the idea of adding a keyboard to to do these mechanical things for playing any kind of instrument is just, speaking as a keyboard maker, it's just, it just begs you, you know, your inventive mind goes to work, and there are ways to do it.
I have two questions. The first one has to do with the accounts that we have of Handel using a, as you call it, an organized instrument, which would have been a harpsichord and an organ. And if you see any connection then to the organized pianos later on, I haven't seen much documentation of such an instrument, but we do find references to that it seems that especially for his operas, he did have this monstrosity built.
Yeah.
But then my second question has to do with the operation of the bellows. We see those pedals. Is any of those pedals to give the player, and does that then become a pump organ in the sense that?
No, here's the bellows pump, and there's a reservoir, and you have to give it enough wind, and there are two standard piano pedals for 1799. You have a damper pedal and an una corda. So, and there's a hand stop, as many English pianos did in that period, a hand stop that made the una corda either Dewey corda or una corda. Which means you need 3 feet is the problem. However, I think, now this is an interesting little discovery I made. I went to quite a lot of trouble to, in a non-invasive way, add side pumping so that without adding a single screw into old wood, I added a side pumping arrangement so that the keyboardist and somebody could pump for our demonstrations. And after I did all that, I think it was like during the week of completion and we were setting it up in the museum, I realized that the metal pedal, unlike any of the other organ pedals I had seen, was instead of being shaped like that, was shaped like, in other words, the two sides were parallel, meaning you could have slipped something on it like a socket and extended it out to the side, so somebody would stand off to the side and pump. But your first question,
Missing a piece there.
yeah,
Perhaps there was a hand.
right, which is gone, and it's separable, right. Your first question was about combining organ and string keyboards, and that goes way back. Henry VIII had several, and I think all through the period, and right up to the present time, basically, they're electronic now. But very soon after this instrument, when the melodeon became common, combining, and Tom has an example in his collection, square pianos with a melodeon built in. So combining organ and pianos, often done almost through the whole keyboard history.
Yeah, just a tiny postscript to that.
Yeah.
The Handel claviorganum, the reconstruction has been made in Gothenburg of that instrument, and the whole idea there is that he used it for oratorio so that he could direct the instruments, and the choir could actually have the organ speaking at them rather than the organ. But if you just go on the website of the Gothenburg Organ Academy or Göteborg Baroque, it's a fantastic instrument and it's based on designs that were made in London. It's an English original.
Okay. Thank you very much. Oh,
Just a quick question.
okay.
You had mentioned that the dulcimer keyboard had an kind of outdated scaling for its time.
Yes.
I missed why that was.
Oh, you got to get early keyboard journal. Yeah, John Coster wrote a Coster-esque article about this, and it's very detailed. But and I avoided getting into it, but let's see if I could give a 60-second summary. If you know anything about string keyboard instruments and scaling, there's Pythagorean scaling in which the strings double in length every octave lower until it has to be foreshortened. This instrument didn't follow that rule. It actually kept getting, it was tapered so that the longest scale, C2 equivalent, is the very top string. And it says if the foreshortening is goes all the way through the scale. Let me answer it a different way. Organ builders can't use Pythagorean scaling, can't double the length and diameters and of pipes, because bass pipes wouldn't speak well, they're too big, and treble pipes wouldn't speak well because they're too narrow. So they have other methods of scaling organ pipes so that it's not Pythagorean. And the scaling method that Clem used was really kind of organ thinking, and kind of old-fashioned organ thinking in scaling. But read John Koster's article, and it gets into the weeds much more than I can.
And the scaling has to do with the gauge of the gauge of the string.
Yeah, it has to do with the length of the string.
Changing gauge.
Oh yeah, sure you do, but by scaling I was really talking about the length. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, we're gonna break for lunch.
He was saying that with that many squares. I remember Willis saying when he went to college, I don't know how old he was, when he went to college in the early 80s, they were just